The morning Cora Merriweather walked into the Dust Creek Community Church carrying the last 2 jars of her blackberry preserves. She had already made peace with the fact that she had nothing left to give. And that was precisely what made giving them away so unbearably hard. Dust Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1878 was a town that sat at the edge of everything and the beginning of nothing. The kind of place where the wind came in sideways off the flatlands and rattled the wooden storefronts until they sounded like they were trying to shake themselves loose from the earth. It was a town of maybe 300 souls, give or take a drifter or two, with one general store run by a man named Harold Finch, who weighed everything twice and charged for the second weighing, one saloon called the Copper Spur that smelled of sour mash and regret, and one church that had been without a proper preacher for 8 months following the sudden departure of Reverend Aldous Crane, who had left one Sunday morning between the first and second hymns and had not been seen since. The new preacher had arrived on the Wednesday stage, and by Thursday morning all of Dust Creek knew his name was Reverend Simon Hartwell, that he was 43 years old, that he had come from a parish in Missouri, and that he had the kind of handsome, angular face that made women bring food to the church. By Friday, 3 pies, a loaf of bread, a smoked ham, and a jar of honey had already been delivered to the modest parsonage beside the church. The congregation was nothing if not eager. Cora Merriweather stood in her kitchen on that same Friday morning and looked at the shelf where she kept her preserves, and she counted them the way a person counts coins when they already know the news is going to be bad. 6 jars of apple butter, 3 jars of peach preserves, 2 jars of blackberry, and 1 jar of green tomato relish. That was the whole of her larder in terms of preserved goods, and those 6 jars of apple butter were promised already to Harold Finch in exchange for the flour and salt she had taken on credit in September. The peach preserves were her daughter Lily's favorite, and Lily was 8 years old and had already lost enough in her short life without losing peach preserves too. The green tomato relish was medicinal in a way, something her late husband Edmund had loved on cold biscuits, and she could not quite bring herself to give that away to a stranger. That left the 2 jars of blackberry. She picked them up carefully, cradled them against her chest, and told herself it was the right thing to do. The church needed to show Reverend Hartwell that Dust Creek was a generous, welcoming town, and Cora Merriweather had always believed that a person's character was most clearly visible in what they gave when they had the least to give. Edmund had taught her that. He had believed it so completely that he had given away the very last of himself, 3 years of his health and strength working the dry, indifferent land of their small homestead, and died of fever in the spring of 1876, leaving her with Lily, who had been 5, and a house that was barely holding itself together, and a piece of land that wanted more rain than Texas generally cared to provide. She wrapped the jars in a piece of clean cloth, straightened her dress, which was brown wool and showed its age at the elbows, settled her bonnet on her head, and called to Lily that she would be back within the hour. Lily was out back feeding the 2 remaining chickens. They had started with 7, and she called back that she understood, and Cora walked the half-mile into town with the preserves held carefully and her chin held higher. The church smelled of fresh-cut pine and candle wax, and the particular dusty holiness of a place that had been without a congregation for a little while, and was just now waking up again. Reverend Hartwell was at the front, arranging the hymnals, and he turned when she came in. He was a decent-looking man, she supposed, with a neat beard and eyes that were perfectly kind and absolutely incapable of making her feel anything at all. "Mrs. Merriweather," he said, because he had already made it his business to learn the names of the women who were widowed and likely to need pastoral attention. "What a gracious gesture." "Blackberry preserves," she said, setting them on the table beside the pulpit. "I put them up in July. They are good on bread or biscuits." "You are very kind," he said. "I understand things have not been easy for you since your husband passed." "Things have not been easy for anyone in Dust Creek for a good long while," she said, which was true, and which shut down any conversation that might have veered toward pity. She said good morning and walked back out into the sharp October air, and she told herself she felt fine about giving those jars away, and she almost believed it. She did not see the man in the back pew. He had been sitting there in the shadow of the last bench, hat in his hands, watching the exchange with a quietness that was more attentive than it appeared. His name was Timothy Slater, and he was 31 years old, and he had ridden into Dust Creek 3 days prior with a horse named Atlas and a bedroll, and a reputation that preceded him in some counties, and was entirely unknown in others. He was a cowboy in the most honest sense of the word. He had worked cattle drives up from the Rio Grande into Kansas, had spent seasons on ranches from the Panhandle to the hill country, and had the hands and the shoulders and the particular distant look in his eyes that came from years of watching horizons and thinking long thoughts in the saddle. He was not a violent man, though he had been in situations that required quick thinking, and he was not a reckless man, though he had made choices that had cost him. He was the kind of man who sat in the back of a church he did not intend to commit to, because the sound of the morning coming through clear windows made him feel something he could not name, and the feeling was worth a few minutes of sitting still. He had watched Cora Merriweather walk in and set down those 2 jars of preserves, and he had watched the way her hands lingered on them just a half-second longer than necessary, the way you hold something before you let it go for good. He had watched the Reverend accept them with the pleasant, practiced gratitude of a man who had received many such offerings and understood their social function without quite grasping their personal cost. Timothy Slater understood it. He had grown up without enough of most things to know what it looked like when someone gave away what they could not afford to give. He sat there for a while after she left, in the quiet of the empty church, hat turning in his hands. Then he stood up, walked back out into the main street of Dust Creek, and asked Harold Finch at the general store where the widow Merriweather lived. Harold Finch, who was a man constitutionally incapable of declining to share information, told him readily, and also added that she was behind on her account, that she had 2 chickens and about 40 acres of dry land and a daughter named Lily, and that it was a hard situation all around. Timothy listened, bought what he needed, and said nothing in return except thank you. Sunday came in cold and bright, the sky that particular sharp blue that October could produce in Texas when it was in a generous mood. The whole of Dust Creek turned out for Reverend Hartwell's first proper sermon, which was about the harvest and God's provision, and which was well received if a little general. Cora sat 3 rows from the front with Lily pressed warm against her side, sharing a hymnal, their 2 voices rising and falling together in a way that made the older women around them smile with something complicated admiration and sympathy mixed up the way feelings often are. Timothy Slater sat in the back pew. He sat there the whole service, long and quiet, taking up space in that particular way that tall men had of seeming to occupy more of a room than their physical dimensions required. He wore a clean shirt that he had clearly pressed himself, because the creases were earnest if not expert, and his hat was off and resting on his knee. He did not join in the singing because he did not know the hymns well enough to feel honest about it, but he listened to everything with the full attention of a man who was used to listening to the land and could redirect that skill toward human things when the situation called for it. After the service, people milled about outside in the clear cold morning, exchanging the kind of conversation that gathered easily on church steps, news about weather and cattle prices, and who was ailing, and who had a new baby on the way. Cora spoke briefly to Martha Hendricks, who ran the boarding house, and to Doc Pierce, who was the closest thing Dust Creek had to a physician and who checked in on Lily occasionally since the child had a tendency toward winter coughs. She did not speak to Timothy Slater because she did not notice him particularly, in the way that people sometimes do not notice the things that will matter most to them. He noticed her. He noticed the way she held herself straight even when she was tired, which she clearly was. He noticed the way she put her hand on Lily's shoulder without thinking about it, just a steady, reflexive protection that said everything about what that child meant to her. He noticed the worn elbows of her dress and the resolute set of her jaw, and the way her dark hair was coming slightly loose from its pins by late morning, which gave her the look of someone who had been working hard since before dawn, which she probably had been. He did not introduce himself. He had no right to do that yet. That afternoon, while the light was still good and the town was half drowsy with Sunday dinner, Timothy Slater rode out to the Merriweather homestead. He tied Atlas to the fence post at the road, not riding up to the house, which would have been an imposition, and he carried 2 items to the front porch. The first was a sack, and the second was also a sack, and between them they held flour, sugar, dried beans, salt pork, coffee, 2 pounds of cornmeal, a paper twist of tea, a small tin of baking powder, and 2 new jars of blackberry preserves that he had found among the goods Harold Finch kept, from a farmwife who sold to the store. He set them on the porch carefully, against the wall where they would not blow over. Then he went back to his horse, and he rode back to town. He had left twice what those preserves had cost her, in food and provision, and he had done it without a name attached and without expectation, because some gestures are not for the recipient to feel grateful. They are for the giver to feel square with the world. Cora found it when she stepped out to bring in the wood for the evening fire. She stood on her porch in the failing light, looking at those 2 sacks, and she felt something move in her chest that was not grief and was not loneliness and was not the familiar ache of managing everything alone. It was something else, something that had been quiet for a long time, and the feeling startled her enough that she pressed her hand flat against her sternum for a moment, as though she needed to hold it still. Lily came to the door. "Mama, what is it?" "Someone left us provisions," Cora said, her voice steady. Lily came out and looked at the sacks with the wide, practical eyes of a child who understood supplies. "Who?" "I do not know," Cora said, and that was true, and the not knowing bothered her in a way she did not entirely understand. She brought everything inside, put it away with the careful order she applied to all her domestic management, and then she stood at her kitchen window and looked out at the darkening land and tried to think of who in Dusk Creek might have done this. She went through her mental list of neighbors and acquaintances, the people who might have felt moved by Christian charity to help her out. She thought of Martha Hendricks, who had been kind before, and Doc Pierce, who helped when he could, and several others. She did not think of the quiet man in the back pew because she did not know him, and people generally do not think of strangers when accounting for kindness. Monday morning, Timothy Slater found work. This was not difficult for a man with his skills. Dusk Creek had a cattle operation 3 miles east of town, run by a rancher named Gerald Briggs, and Gerald Briggs was always in need of a steady hand before the winter shipping season. Timothy presented himself at first light, showed his references in the form of 2 letters from ranch foremen he had worked under in previous seasons, and was hired on the spot at $1 a day plus meals. He moved his bedroll from the boarding house to the bunkhouse, settled Atlas in the stable, and began the work of being reliable. He was, by all accounts, exceptionally good at his job. He was the first up in the mornings and the last to complain, and he had a way with cattle that was less about force and more about understanding. He seemed to know how an animal was going to move before it moved, which made him invaluable on the open range and deeply respected by the other hands, most of whom were rougher men who had learned to express respect through the withholding of contempt. Wednesday evening, 2 days after he had left the provisions, Timothy walked to the church for the midweek prayer meeting that Reverend Hartwell had announced he would be holding. He did not go for the prayer meeting exactly. He went because he had been thinking about a woman with dark hair coming loose from its pins, and he had enough self-knowledge to understand that sitting in the back of the church where she might also be sitting was the closest to an introduction he was prepared to engineer. She was there. She was sitting in the same pew as before, but this time without Lily, who was presumably at home, and the absence of the child beside her made her look, somehow, more solitary, not lonelier, but more distinctly herself. A woman occupying her own space with a completeness that had nothing to do with having company. The prayer meeting was smaller than Sunday service. Maybe 15 people, and afterward Reverend Hartwell made a point of introducing Timothy to those who had not yet met him, because preachers in small towns were attentive to their congregations and Timothy's presence had been noted. Mrs. Merriweather, Reverend Hartwell said, with the smooth efficiency of a man used to making social connections, I do not believe you have met Mr. Slater. He has recently taken up work with Gerald Briggs. Cora turned, and she looked at Timothy Slater for the first time in the way that you actually look at a person, not the general impression you gather from sharing a room, but the specific recognition of an individual standing in front of you. He was tall. That was the first thing. Not unreasonably so, but enough that she had to look up slightly, and she was not a short woman. His hair was dark and needed cutting, and his face was weathered in the manner of all men who spent their days outdoors, with lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting at distances. His eyes were gray, which was unusual, and they were looking at her with a directness that was not aggressive but was absolutely unambiguous. He was paying attention, thoroughly and without apology. Mr. Slater, she said, and offered her hand, because she was the daughter of a woman who had believed in direct greetings. He took her hand and shook it briefly, and his hand was very warm and very calloused and entirely capable. Mrs. Merriweather, he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to be heard. I have heard good things about Dust Creek. I am glad to be here. Have you been to services before? She asked, because she was certain she had not seen him before Sunday, and she was the kind of woman who noticed the composition of a room. Sunday was my first, he said, and I have been coming back. I find I like the quiet of it. She nodded at that because the quiet of a church was something she understood and appreciated. Do you have family nearby, Mr. Slater? No, ma'am, he said simply. I travel with my work generally. Well, she said, and she was gathering her shawl to leave, I hope Dust Creek is kind to you. It has been so far, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made her pause for just a moment, a weight to the words that suggested they meant something more specific than their surface content. But she could not catch hold of what it was, and she said good evening and walked home in the cold, clear dark. She thought about his gray eyes for 3 full days before she decided that was unreasonable and stopped doing it deliberately. She was 29 years old. She had been a widow for 2.5 years. She had 40 acres, 2 chickens, a daughter who deserved better than what the land was currently providing, and a shelf of preserves that was now better stocked than it had been, thanks to some anonymous generosity that still occupied a corner of her mind. She had practical problems, and she needed practical solutions, and mooning over the eye color of cowboys was not practical. She threw herself into the work of November, which was considerable. There was the kitchen garden to put to bed for the winter, the cellar to inspect for damp, the fence on the south side that had needed mending since August and was not going to mend itself, the woodpile that needed building before the first hard freeze, and the constant, careful management of what little money she had against what she needed to spend it on. It was the fence that introduced her to Timothy Slater the second time. He was riding past on Atlas. The Briggs Ranch was along the road that ran near her property, and he saw her fighting with a fence post that had heaved itself up out of the dry ground and was stubbornly refusing to be persuaded back in. She had a mallet, which was the right tool, and she had been at it for 20 minutes and the post was winning. He pulled up and sat on his horse for a moment, watching with the expression of a man deciding whether offering to help was welcome or presumptuous. She looked up, recognized him, and the recognition seemed to settle the question for both of them simultaneously. It is the ground, she said, by way of explanation that was also an invitation. It has dried out so much this season that the post has no grip. You need to wet the ground around the base, he said, and then pack it back down with smaller stones before you drive it. Otherwise, it will heave again come spring." "I know that," she said, "but the well is 60 yards and I have been putting off carrying water until I finished this." He dismounted, because that was the only reasonable thing to do. He tied Atlas to the fence itself, the parts that were still standing, and he looked at the post and then at the ground around it, and he said, "I will get the water if you tell me where the bucket is." She told him, and he made the trips, and it took 4 buckets, and while the ground was soaking he used the mallet the right way, not beating the post down by force but working the earth loose and repositioning it. And by the time the light had shifted half an hour, they had a post that was set properly and would not heave again until at least the following spring. He stood back and looked at it with the quiet satisfaction of completed work. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it without reservation. "Can I offer you something? I have coffee." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "I would be glad of coffee," he said. They sat on the porch in the cold afternoon, because the house was her private territory, and she was not yet ready for a near stranger in it. And she brought out 2 tin cups of coffee that was strong and good, and they talked. Not dramatically, not with the awareness of anything being built between them. Or at least, that was what she told herself afterward, but with the easy, gradually deepening quality of 2 people who were discovering they could talk. She asked him where he was from, and he said he was from a small town in Kansas, outside of Abilene, that he had left when he was 18 to hire on with a cattle drive, and had never quite gone back because there was nothing much to go back to. His father had died when he was 15. His mother had remarried a man named Packard who was not unkind but was not his father, and the going seemed more honest than the staying. She told him about Edmund without planning to, just the basic facts of it, that he had been a good man, a steady man, that he had worked himself thin trying to make the land produce what it would not, that the fever had taken him in 3 days, and she had held his hand for all 3 of them. She said it without breaking down, because she had done her breaking down in private over the past 2 years, and had reached the place where the story could be told whole. Timothy listened in the particular way he had, which was to give his full attention without rushing anything or filling silences with reassurance. He just listened, and when she had finished he said, "He sounds like a man who loved what he had." "He did," she said, and it was the exactly right thing to say, and she felt it in the center of her chest again, that quiet, startling thing. They finished their coffee and he left, and she stood on the porch watching him ride away on the big gray horse until they were just a shape in the distance, and then she went inside and took her time about the evening tasks and did not let herself dwell. But November was long, and the days were short, and people have their own seasons the same as the land does. The following Sunday he was in the back pew again, and this time she was aware of him from the moment she sat down, in the way you become aware of the presence of something large and warm in a cold room, not seeing it exactly, but sensing it, knowing it is there behind you. After the service, he fell into step beside her on the walk out through the churchyard, entirely naturally, as though they had been walking out of churches together for years. And Lily, who had come today, looked up at him with the frank, assessing gaze of a child who had been raised by a woman who trusted her own instincts and had passed the habit along. "Are you the man who helped my mama with the fence?" Lily asked. Timothy looked down at her with an expression that was not condescension and was not performance. It was simple, direct acknowledgement. "I am," he said. "You must be Lily." "I am," she said, in a perfect imitation of his grave manner, and he smiled, which changed his face in a way that Cora was not prepared for. It moved all the weather out of it and left something younger and warmer behind. "Mama said you were useful," Lily continued. "I am glad to be," he said. Cora put her hand on Lily's shoulder, less to silence her than to have something to do with her hands. "Lily," she said gently. "She also said your eyes are a strange color," Lily added. Cora felt the heat rise to her face with an immediacy that was both universal and deeply unwelcome. Timothy Slater looked at Cora with those gray eyes and the smile still on, and to his enormous credit he said, "That is quite fair, and nothing more, and Cora made a mental note to speak to Lily about the relationship between private thoughts and public speech, and they walked the rest of the way to the edge of town, where their paths diverged without quite recovering the ease of the earlier moments, but with something new between them that was perhaps better than ease. That evening she found herself wondering what it would be like not to do everything alone, and then she spent a considerable amount of time being stern with herself for wondering it, because she was a practical woman and longing was not practical. But here was the thing about practical women. They were also just women, and longing is not particularly impressed by practicality. November turned serious in its second week, bringing the kind of cold that came down from the north without apology and set itself in. Cora's woodpile, which she had been building steadily, was adequate but not comfortable. The stove in the kitchen worked hard. Lily developed the winter cough that Doc Pierce had predicted, and Cora slept lightly for several nights, listening to the sound of the child breathing in the next room, measuring the quality of each breath. Doc Pierce came by on a Tuesday and pronounced it a common cold, nothing more, and left a small bottle of something for the cough that cost $3 that Cora did not have and added to her account with him. She thanked him and saw him out and stood in her kitchen, and did what she rarely allowed herself to do. She let the weight of it all press down for a moment. The money that was never enough, the land that wanted more than she could give it, the fence posts and the well and the leaking corner of the roof and the chickens that were aging toward uselessness, and the fact that every single decision in this household came back to her alone. She had a good solid cry about it for approximately 4 minutes, which was the amount of time she had determined was useful before it became self-indulgent. Then she washed her face, went back to the stove, and put another pot of water on for the steam that helped Lily breathe easier at night. She did not tell anyone about this, because she was Cora Merriweather and she managed her own affairs. But the town of Dust Creek was small, and people talked, and Martha Hendricks mentioned to Gerald Briggs at the general store that Mrs. Merriweather's little girl had taken sick, and Gerald Briggs mentioned it in the bunkhouse that evening, and Timothy Slater heard it while he was cleaning his saddle, and he sat very still for a moment with the cleaning cloth in his hands. He did not go to the house. That would have been inappropriate for a man who was not family and not yet even a proper friend. But the next morning, before first light, he got up and rode into town and spoke to Harold Finch when the store opened at 6, and he arranged for a box of provisions to be delivered to the Merriweather place that afternoon with a note that said only, "For Lily's recovery. Get well, Miss Merriweather." The provisions included the specific items that were good for sick children: honey, dried chamomile, a fresh ham that would make good strong broth, a bag of cornmeal for porridge, and 3 oranges that had come in on the last supply wagon from San Antonio and cost more than any sensible person spent on fruit. Lily got the oranges and was delighted by them in the way that children are delighted by things that are unexpected and sweet, and Cora sat on the edge of the bed and peeled one for her and watched the child's face and thought about who kept leaving things on her porch and in her life. She thought about the back pew. She thought about gray eyes and a voice that didn't hurry. She went to Harold Finch the next day, ostensibly for thread. "Harold," she said, while he was finding her the right color, "has anyone asked about my account lately?" Harold Finch had the conscience of a man who knew what discretion cost but also knew what information was worth. "Can't say I recall particularly," he said, in the manner of a man recalling very particularly indeed. "Has Mr. Slater been in recently?" Harold found the thread. "He was in yesterday morning," he said. "Bought a few things." He looked at the thread and nodded at her. Cora paid for the thread and went home and sat at her kitchen table for a while, looking out the window at the brown November land, and she felt that thing in her chest again, that quiet, startling motion, and this time she did not press her hand against it to still it. She let it move. She let herself sit with it. She was 29 years old and she had loved one man completely and lost him and kept going, and she had told herself she was managing perfectly well on her own because she was. And because the alternative, needing someone, wanting someone, opening up the place that had been closed since the spring of 1876, was frightening in a way that the practical problems of her daily life were not. Practical problems you could solve with effort and sense. The other kind required something else entirely. Sunday again, the church bright and cold, the hymns rising up to the pine rafters. And she sat in her pew and heard, from behind and to the left, in the last bench, the sound of a voice she recognized joining in the singing for the first time, low and a little uncertain with the melody. The voice of a man who did not sing often but had decided to try, and she kept her eyes on her hymnal and smiled. After the service she turned before she had thought about whether to turn, before she had decided anything, and she found him there, hat in his hands, letting the last of the congregation file past him, looking at her with those direct gray eyes that she had apparently been discussing out loud. "Mr. Slater," she said, "I want to thank you." His expression did not change, but something in his stillness did. "For the singing," he said, "because I will be honest with you, I am not sure it deserved thanks. For the provision," she said clearly, "for both times." He was quiet for a moment. The last of the congregation had moved outside and they were essentially alone in the church in the cold light through the windows, and the moment had its own kind of gravity. "How did you know it was me?" he said. "I asked Harold Finch," she said. "Harold Finch," he said, with the resignation of a man whose confidence has been placed in the wrong vessel. "He did not say it directly," she offered. "He is a little better than that." "A little," Timothy agreed. "I want you to know," she said, and she was choosing her words carefully because she wanted them to be exact, "that I am grateful, and that I also want to be sure you understand I am not a charity case. I manage my household and my land and my daughter, and I have done so for nearly 3 years. "I know that," he said, without any defensiveness or apology. "That is not why I did it." "Then why did you?" she asked, and she met his eyes and held them because she was also the kind of woman who looked at things directly. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind pushed at the church windows. Outside, the voices of the congregation drifted and faded. "Because I watched you put something on that table," he said. "That cost you more than it should have, and you did it without a word about the cost. And then I watched a man receive it the same way a man receives something that doesn't cost him anything at all." He paused. "I have spent a lot of years watching how people treat what is given to them. It matters." Cora looked at him for a long time. "That is a very particular way to look at the world," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I developed it gradually." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Would you like to come to dinner on Sunday evening? Lily has been asking about the man with the strange-colored eyes." Something moved in his face that was warm and careful at the same time. "I would be very glad to," he said. The dinner was not elaborate because she did not have the means for elaborate, but what she produced was excellent. She was a genuinely good cook, and she made a ham that fell off the bone and biscuits that were light and properly done, and a pot of the green tomato relish that had been Edmund's, which she served because it was there, and because it was good, and because she was not, she had decided, going to make a shrine out of a jar of relish. Timothy Slater sat at her kitchen table and ate with the focused, genuine appreciation of a man who had been eating bunkhouse food for weeks, and he said so plainly, and she received the compliment as it was meant. Lily sat across from him and interrogated him with the systematic thoroughness of a child who has decided someone is interesting. "Do you have children?" Lily asked. "No," he said. "Have you ever been married?" "Lily," Cora said. "I am just asking," Lily said. Timothy looked at Lily and then at Cora with a slight smile. "I have not," he said. "I have been moving around too much for that." "Are you going to stay in Dust Creek?" Lily pressed. "I think I might," he said, and he looked at Cora when he said it just for a moment, and she looked at her biscuit. After dinner, Lily was put to bed, and Timothy helped Cora clear the table with the natural ease of a person who had decided helping was preferable to standing and watching. And they talked while they worked about the Briggs Ranch, which he described with the amused, affectionate precision of a man who liked his employer but was under no illusions about him. about the land around Dust Creek and what it might grow if the rains cooperated, about Lily's reading, which was precocious and impressive, and about the book that Cora had on the shelf beside the fireplace, which was a copy of David Copperfield, battered at the spine from rereading. "You have read that more than once," he observed. "Several times," she said. "I like books that know something true about how difficult things happen to people and how they keep going anyway." He looked at the book and then at her. "That is a very exact thing to like about a book." "I am a fairly exact person," she said. "I have noticed," he said, and his tone was warm and entirely without irony. He left when the evening was properly over, thanked her for dinner in a way that was simple and sincere, and she closed the door behind him and stood in her kitchen for a moment in the pleasant, slightly bewildering aftermath of an evening that had felt more like belonging than she had allowed herself in a very long time. December came in hard and beautiful, with the first frost that turned the flat brown landscape into something that was briefly, surprisingly lovely. Timothy was a fixture in the back pew now, which was remarked upon by the congregation with the eager attentiveness of small-town people who had made a hobby out of knowing other people's business. It was also remarked upon that he and Mrs. Merriweather sometimes walked the same direction after services, and that he had been seen at her property twice on weekday afternoons, fixing the section of fence that had given way on the north side, and later patching the corner of the roof that had been leaking since last winter. Martha Hendricks told Doc Pierce that she thought it was very nice for Cora to have someone reliable looking after her place. Doc Pierce said she thought there was more to it than practicality, and raised an eyebrow that said everything. Martha Hendricks said she certainly hoped so because Cora Merriweather had been running herself ragged for 2 years and deserved something good, and Doc Pierce agreed wholeheartedly, and they both pretended they were not absolutely delighted by the prospect of a romance. The romance was, in fact, proceeding with the deliberate pace of two people who had both learned that rushing things led to regret. They had fallen into a rhythm that felt, to both of them, surprising in its naturalness. Sunday dinners became a standing arrangement without being formally declared as such. He simply appeared, and she simply set a place, and Lily simply took it as established fact, which children have a particular talent for. He helped with the heavier work around the property on the weekends, not because she asked him, but because the work was there and he had the skills for it, and it seemed wasteful to pretend otherwise. She sent food with him when he went back, a pie, a jar of something which was its own language, and he understood it as such. They talked. This was the thing that Cora had not expected, that he would be a man who talked in the real sense of it, who had thoughts worth hearing, and who listened to hers with the same quality of attention he gave to everything. He told her about the cattle drives, the particular solitude of them, the way the land changed state by state going north, the way the sky at night on the open range was so full of stars that it felt almost oppressive, too much beauty with too little context. She told him about her childhood in East Texas, her parents' farm that had been better watered than this one, the way she had loved school and wished she had been able to stay in it longer. She told him that she had plans for the land that Edmund had not lived to see implemented, ideas about what to plant and how to rotate the fields, and he listened to these plans with the concentrated interest of a man who was genuinely considering them, asking questions that were practical and useful. She began to understand that he was the kind of man who paid attention to things as they were, not as he wished them to be, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience of the world. He began to understand that she was the kind of woman who had a very clear and carefully constructed inner life, and that being let into it was something she did not do carelessly, and that the fact that she was letting him in at all was not nothing. December brought Christmas, which in Dust Creek was a modest affair by the standards of larger places, but was enthusiastic and genuine. The church was decorated with cedar branches and candles, and Reverend Hartwell gave a long sermon that improved considerably in the second half, and afterward there was a gathering at the church hall with food brought by everyone. Cora brought 2 pies and a covered dish of sweet potatoes, and Timothy brought a smoked turkey that he had acquired with the casual competence of a man who knew how to make a hunt productive, and it was the centerpiece of the whole table. Lily wore her good dress, which was getting short in the hem, and Timothy looked at it and then, the following week, left a bundle of blue wool fabric on the porch with a note saying, "For Lily's dress, if you do the making," which she did because she was a good seamstress, and Lily's face when she saw the new dress was worth more than the wool cost. "You have got to stop leaving things on my porch," Cora said to him, not with real reproach, when she found out it had been him. "I will consider it," he said, in a way that they both knew meant he would not. It was a week before Christmas when he said the thing that opened the door properly. They were sitting by her fireplace after Sunday dinner, Lily in bed, the fire doing what fires do in the best of circumstances, making everything inside feel safe and close against the dark and the cold outside. She was mending something because her hands were rarely idle, and he was looking at the fire with the long gaze of a man thinking through something carefully, and then he said, without looking away from the fire, "Cora, I need to tell you that I am not a man who is good at saying things in the right order. So I am going to say this plainly, and I hope you will forgive the plainness." She set down her mending, because she could hear that this required her full attention. He looked at her then, and his face was entirely open in a way. It usually wasn't. All the quiet reserve moved aside, and what was there underneath was something unguarded and serious and warm. "I have been in a good number of places," he said, "and I have met a good number of people, and I have generally found that the world goes on well enough without me in any particular part of it. I have not had any strong reason to stay anywhere before now." He paused. "I have a strong reason now. And I want you to know that. And I want you to know that I understand it may be too soon. And I understand you have a child and a house and a life that does not need to be disrupted by something uncertain. And I am not asking you for anything tonight except permission to keep being here while we both figure out if this is what I think it is." The fire settled with a soft sound. Outside, the December wind moved around the house looking for gaps. Cora looked at this man who had sat in the back of a church and watched her give away the last of what she had, and had doubled it on her porch without asking for anything, and who had fixed her fence posts and her roof, and sat at her table, and listened to her talk about the land, and asked the right questions, and never once made her feel like a project or a charity case. And she thought about practicality, and she thought about the 3 years of managing alone, and she thought about what she had said to Lily once. That being brave was not the absence of being afraid. It was knowing when the thing in front of you was worth the being afraid. "I think it is what you think it is," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and the smile came back, the one that moved the weather out of his face, and this time she looked at it straight on and did not look away. They were quiet together by the fire for a while after that, and it was the most contented quiet Cora had known in 3 years, and she thought Edmund would have recognized it and been glad for her, because Edmund had been that kind of man. January came in with cold and purpose, and the world changed its pace. Timothy's work at the Briggs Ranch shifted with the season. Less driving, more maintenance. The winter work of fences and equipment and feeding stock through the cold months. He had time on the weekends that the summer and fall had not allowed, and he spent a significant portion of it at the Merriweather homestead. He and Cora worked the land together on the days she had tasks that would be faster with 2 pairs of hands, and he discovered that she was exactly as competent as she appeared. She knew what she was doing. She had thought carefully about what the land needed, and her plans for the spring planting were genuinely sound. He offered suggestions where he had knowledge she didn't, and she received them without ego, which was one of the things about her he respected most. Lily took to him with the unself-conscious completeness of a child who has decided on a person. She showed him her reading, which was indeed remarkable for an 8-year-old, and he listened to her read aloud with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, and made comments that were thoughtful enough that she looked at him with increased respect and kept going. He helped her with a multiplication problem that had been vexing her for a week, not by telling her the answer, but by taking her through it in a way that made the answer feel like something she had found herself. And she beamed at him for approximately 3 minutes and then immediately moved to the next problem. Cora watched this, and the thing in her chest was very full. February brought a thaw and then another hard freeze, and then a stretch of clear days that smelled like the promise of spring, even though spring was still weeks away. And on one of these clear days, Timothy rode Atlas out to the homestead and found Cora standing in the kitchen garden turning soil, her cheeks red with cold and exertion. And he got down from his horse and got a second spade from the tool shed and worked beside her, and they turned soil together for 2 hours without much conversation. Just the clean work of preparing ground for what would come. When they stopped to rest, leaning on their spades, looking at the turned earth, Cora said, "Timothy, what do you want?" He looked at her. "From this moment, from life," she said, "not from the land or the work, from life." He considered that with the seriousness it deserved. "I want to stop being in motion," he said. "I have been moving for 13 years and I am tired of it in the specific way you get tired of something that you chose and that served its purpose and that is now no longer what you need." He paused. "I want to belong to something, a place, a life, people." His eyes were on her with a steadiness that left no ambiguity. "I want this, Cora, not the idea of this, this." She pressed her lips together for a moment, because the directness of it moved her and she was still, in some deep place, not entirely sure she trusted herself to receive it fully. "My husband died," she said, "and it broke me in ways I have not entirely finished repairing. And I put myself back together mostly through sheer stubbornness, and I am proud of that, and I am also frightened, honestly, of choosing this and then losing it." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you not to be frightened. I am just asking if the frightened is worth getting through." She looked at him for a long time in the cold February light, with the smell of turned earth between them. "Yes," she said, "it is." He crossed the small distance between them and took her hands in both of his, and they stood there in the kitchen garden with the cold moving around them and the turned soil at their feet and the wide open Texas sky overhead. And he said her name quietly, just the once, and she leaned her forehead against his chest because it felt like the right place to put it. And his arms came around her with the same quality everything he did had: careful, deliberate, completely present. They stood there for a while, and the world was very still. March arrived and brought with it the particular business of spring preparation, and the particular business of being two people who had declared themselves, and were now navigating what that meant in the daily geography of their lives. He was at her place more often than not on the weekends, and the weekday evenings found him riding by, ostensibly for other reasons, and stopping when the light was good, and she was outside to exchange a few words that stretched naturally into longer conversations. The whole of Dust Creek watched with benevolent interest, and Martha Hendricks updated Doc Pierce on developments every Sunday, and Doc Pierce said she thought it was progressing nicely, and Martha said she thought so too, and they were both right. The injustices of the world still pressed in at the edges of their lives, as they pressed in at the edges of everyone's in that time and place. There were homesteaders being pushed off land by men with better lawyers. There were families along the southern road who had worked their ground for generations and found themselves navigating a system that had not been built to protect them. Timothy, who had ridden through enough of the country to have seen more than most, spoke about these things with Cora with the honest directness of a man who believed in calling things what they were. She listened and agreed and added her own observations, because she had seen the same forces at work on smaller scales. The way certain people's accounts at Harold Finch's store were treated differently. The way certain families in the valley were consistently overlooked when community help was organized. They talked about it honestly, which was its own form of respect. April brought the planting, which was the most hopeful work there was. Timothy was there for all of it, taking full days on Saturdays to help turn the larger fields, and she watched him work with the particular appreciation she felt for competence in all its forms, the way he read the soil, the way he managed the horse-drawn implement she had borrowed from Gerald Briggs, the way he knew when to stop and when to keep going. By the end of April, the Merriweather homestead had more under cultivation than it had in years, and the prospects for the summer felt genuinely promising. The evening after the last field was planted, they sat on the porch in the warm spring dark, and the air smelled of turned earth and something beginning, and Timothy said, "I need to speak to you about something." She waited. "Gerald Briggs has offered me a position as his foreman," he said. "Full-time year-round with a salary and a house on the property. It is a good offer." "That is wonderful," she said, and she meant it, though she was also calculating what it would mean practically. "The house is 3 miles east," he said, "which is further from you than the bunkhouse." She understood what he was circling. "Timothy." "I'm trying to do this in the right order," he said, with a slight self-directed frustration that she found endearing. "I'm trying to ask you properly." "Then ask me properly," she said, and her voice was gentle. He turned to look at her in the spring darkness, and she could see the outline of his face and the steadiness of his eyes, and he said, "Cora Merriweather, I want to marry you. I want to make a life here with you and Lily and on this land, and I want to stop being a man without a place to belong. I am not a man of great means, but I am a man of honest work and honest heart, and I promise you that I will not give you cause to regret trusting me, if you will have me." The spring night was very quiet. She could hear Lily in the house, the soft sound of a child shifting in sleep. She thought about 2 jars of blackberry preserves set on a table, and 2 sacks left on a porch, and a man who doubled what she gave without being asked and never expected credit. She thought about the gray eyes and the voice that didn't hurry and the way he had held her in the kitchen garden in February with his arms around her like something settled and sure. She thought about Edmund, and she thought that Edmund would have extended his hand and said, "Timothy Slater, I am glad to know you," because Edmund had known what was good. "Yes," she said. He exhaled as though he had been holding something in for a while. "Yes," she said again, more firmly, and she was smiling, and he leaned forward and kissed her the first time, quiet and warm and unhurried, the way everything with him was, and she kissed him back in the spring dark on her porch, with the planted land in front of them and the sleeping child inside, and it felt like arriving somewhere. They set the wedding for June, because June was reasonable and gave them time to prepare, and because Lily, when told, immediately began planning with the single-minded organizational enthusiasm of a child who has decided this is her project now. She had opinions about flowers, which were wildflowers from the meadow east of town, and opinions about the dress, which should be Cora's blue calico with the white collar, because it was the most beautiful thing Cora owned, and opinions about the food, which should definitely include the peach preserves because they were the best thing and deserved to be at important occasions. Cora let Lily plan most of it, because the joy of watching the child's complete investment in this happiness was better than any elaborate arrangement she could have designed herself. The wedding was on a Saturday in June, in the church where it had all begun, and the whole of Dust Creek came. The cedar smell of the building mingled with the wildflowers that Lily had arranged with more enthusiasm than precision, and the result was something loose and alive and genuinely lovely. Reverend Hartwell, who had received Cora's preserves and had thus been a small part of all of this in a way he did not entirely know, performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity and warmth. Martha Hendricks cried from the second row. Doc Pierce sat beside her and smiled. Gerald Briggs attended from the back with several of his ranch hands, including the whole crew who had watched Timothy Slater become a man with somewhere to be over the past 8 months. Cora stood at the front of the church in her blue calico with the white collar and her dark hair properly pinned for once, and she looked at Timothy Slater standing beside her in his best shirt and a borrowed jacket that fit him almost exactly right, and she felt the thing in her chest that had been moving since October settle into something permanent and warm and steady. He took her hands in his, and his hands were exactly as warm and capable as they had always been. And he said his vows in that low, unhurried voice, with the full attention he gave to everything, looking at her the whole time, meaning every word so plainly that several people in the congregation had to find their composure. She said hers back, and she meant them the same way, with the particular precision of a woman who chose her words carefully. Lily, who was standing beside her as her attendant and was taking the responsibility with great seriousness, handed over the ring at exactly the right moment, and then looked up at Timothy with an expression that combined approval and ownership in equal measure. And he looked back at her with an expression that said, "I am yours too," which was the thing she had most needed to see. The reception was on the church lawn in the June warmth, and there was food in generous quantity. The town had contributed with the collective enthusiasm they reserved for events that felt genuinely worth celebrating. And there was music from two men who played fiddle, and Cora danced with her new husband for the first time, which was something she had not done since Edmund's time, and which felt like learning a language you already knew in your body and had only temporarily forgotten. He was not an elegant dancer, but he was a natural one. He moved with the same good sense he brought to everything, responding to what was actually there rather than what was supposed to be there, and they figured out each other's rhythms with the easy speed of two people who had already been figuring each other out for 8 months. Lily danced with both of them, and with Martha Hendricks, and with two of the older ranch hands who spun her around and made her shriek with delight, and her face that whole afternoon was the pure, uncomplicated face of a child who is happy, and Cora kept seeing it from across the lawn and feeling almost overwhelmed by it. They moved Timothy's few possessions to the Merriweather homestead. He had already spoken to Gerald Briggs about the foremanship, and they had arranged it so that Timothy could live on Cora's land and ride to the Briggs ranch each day, which was entirely workable, and which Gerald Briggs had agreed to with the pragmatic good humor of a man who recognized that keeping a good foreman meant accommodating his life. The first morning of their married life, Cora woke before dawn as she always did, and she lay still for a moment and listened to the changed quality of the house, the different breathing, the slight shift in the weight and temperature of things, the sense of a second presence that was not her daughter's smaller presence but something larger and steadier, and she thought, with great clarity and no doubt, "This is right." She got up and started the stove, and he was up 15 minutes later, moving through the kitchen with the care of a person learning a space, and they made coffee together without saying much, in the very comfortable pre-dawn quiet of two people who did not need to fill every moment with words, and she thought this was one of the most important tests of a partnership, whether you could be quiet in it, and they passed it easily. The summer was the best season the Merriweather land had seen in years. The rains came with better regularity than the previous 2 summers, and the crops that Timothy and Cora had planted together in April came in strong. The corn was good. The kitchen garden was abundant. The sorghum on the larger field produced a yield that meant the account at Harold Finch's would be cleared, and there would be actual money left over, which Cora had not been able to say in 3 years. She stood at the edge of the field in August with the corn tall around her and the summer sun full overhead, and she thought of Edmund, who had wanted this for the land and had not lived to see it, and she let herself feel that grief cleanly for a moment, not as something that canceled out the present happiness, but as something that existed alongside it, the way most things in a full life do. Timothy came and stood beside her, because he had read something in her posture from across the field, and he did not say anything, just stood next to her and let her have the moment. And after a while she put her hand through the crook of his arm and he covered it with his, and they stood there together in the tall corn, and she felt that the 2 griefs and the 1 happiness could all exist in the same heart without contradiction, and that was something worth knowing. Autumn came again, the second autumn since he had ridden into Dusk Creek on Atlas, and the church held a harvest celebration that was better attended and better supplied than anything it had managed in recent memory, partly because the season had been good to several of the homesteaders in the area, and partly because Timothy Slater, as Gerald Briggs's foreman, had organized the donation of a dressed steer for the community meal, which was the kind of contribution that made a town feel like a town. Lily was 9 years old in September and had grown 3 inches in the year and was reading at a level that made the schoolteacher, a woman named Miss Everly who had come to Dust Creek in July, look at her with the particular expression teachers reserve for children who make their work feel meaningful. She should go further in her education than Dust Creek will be able to take her, Miss Everly told Cora privately. I know, Cora said. We are working toward that. The "we" was new and felt solid in her mouth, and she liked it. In November of that year, Cora told Timothy that she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen in the morning because she was a person who did not dress things up or postpone what needed to be said. She told him plainly and watched his face. He sat down. She had never seen him sit down for news before. He was the kind of person who received everything standing, who processed things while in motion. But he sat down in the kitchen chair and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, and then the expression resolved itself into something so openly moved that she felt her own throat tighten. Cora, he said, I know it is sooner than we perhaps planned, she said. We did not plan anything, actually, he said, and the smile was there, the one that cleared the weather from his face. I am very glad. His voice was steady, but the gladness in it was absolute. I am very, very glad. She crossed the kitchen and he stood up to meet her, and they held each other for a long time in the morning light, and the stove ticked and the October wind moved outside, and it was enough. Lily received the news with the solemnity of a child who has processed important information and reached a carefully considered conclusion. Is it going to be a boy or a girl? Was her first question. We will not know until it arrives, Cora said. I would like a brother, Lily said, with a specificity that suggested she had already thought it through. I know boys are very loud, but I think a brother would be useful. Timothy, from across the table, was clearly working very hard not to laugh. I will pass that request along to the universe, Cora said. The winter was gentle compared to the previous one, which felt like a gift. The homestead was warm and well-provisioned and properly repaired. The roof above the bedroom no longer leaked even when the rain came hard. The wood pile was the best Cora had ever had, and the larder shelf was full in a way she had not let herself take for granted since before Edmund died. She and Timothy fell into the deep, daily intimacy of a shared life with the same ease they had found in everything else. The conversations across the table, the working through of small problems and larger ones, the comfortable silences, the particular tenderness that had come to characterize the way he moved around her, the way she had stopped bracing for the weight of everything being hers alone. He was a good man. She had known it from the first honest attention she had given him, and living alongside it daily only confirmed what she had seen. He discovered her reading, really discovered it, not just the fact of the Dickens on the shelf, but the depth of it. The way she had been reading seriously and widely for her whole life, borrowing from anyone who would lend and ordering the occasional volume from the catalog when she could spare the cost. He found this wonderful in a way that was genuine and specific, not performed appreciation but real interest, and he began to read more himself, working through the books on her shelf with the same thorough attention he gave to any project. And they began to talk about what they read the way they talked about the land and the crops with investment and real thought. There was a particular cold evening in February when they sat up late by the fire and talked about David Copperfield, the book that had been on her shelf when he first came to dinner, and she explained what she had said to him then, that she loved it for knowing something true about difficulty and continuance. And he said he understood that better now, having read it, but that what struck him most was the way the book understood that people were not one thing. That they could be flawed and good and mistaken and right all at once. And she said yes, exactly. And they looked at each other in the firelight with the recognition of two people who keep discovering that they have arrived at the Same conclusions from different directions, and it was very good. Spring came, and with it the baby. He arrived on an April morning which felt appropriate, the month that Cora had always associated with beginnings, with the planting of things that would become something. The labor was attended by Doc Pierce, who was very calm and very competent, and by Martha Hendricks, who held Cora's hand and told her she was doing wonderfully and cried twice, and by Lily, who had insisted on being present for the beginning of her brother's life, and who stood in the corner of the bedroom with wide eyes and the serious, intent expression of a person witnessing something important. Timothy was outside, because that was the custom, but Doc Pierce opened the door when the baby came to let him know, and he was inside so fast that she was clearly the fastest door opening of Doc Pierce's career. The baby was a boy, as Lily had requested, and he was red-faced and furious and perfect, and Lily said, "Oh," in a voice that was entirely different from her usual voice, softer and astonished, and Timothy sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife, and the expression on his face was beyond what words had been designed to carry. "What will you call him?" Martha Hendricks asked, through her tears. Cora looked at Timothy. They had spoken about names but had not landed firmly on one. "Edmund," Timothy said, without hesitation, looking at Cora with a directness that asked and answered at the same time. She felt the word land in her chest with the particular weight of something given freely and received fully. "Edmund Timothy Slater," she said. Lily, from her corner, said with great satisfaction, "That is a very good name." Edmund Timothy Slater was, as advertised, very loud. He announced his presence at all hours and with considerable force, and the homestead rearranged itself around him with the cheerful chaos that newborns bring to every house that has been waiting for them without knowing it. Lily was devoted to him with a completeness that she transferred directly and without diminishment from the solemnity of her initial response. She held him with great care and told him things she thought were important about multiplication, about the books on the shelf, about how good the peach preserves were, and how he would understand when he was older. She did this with the earnest conviction of a child who has decided that her brother's education is partly her responsibility, and Timothy and Cora watched it and felt, in parallel, that whatever they had built together was exactly what it needed to be. Summer came in warm and full, and the land that had been in Cora's hands and then in both their hands together was productive and alive, and the chickens had been supplemented by 8 new ones so that the flock was properly useful again, and there was a kitchen garden that would have made her mother proud, and a root cellar that was well stocked, and a shelf of preserves that included blackberry, peach, apple butter, green tomato relish, plum jam, and a new experiment in watermelon rind that was Timothy's idea, and which turned out surprisingly well. She stood at that shelf one evening in July, with the baby on her hip and the summer outside the window, and she looked at all those jars and thought of 2 jars of blackberry that she had carried to a church on a cold October morning, and set on a table and given away because it was right, and how that small act of giving had somehow, in ways she could not have predicted, led her here, to this kitchen, to this life, to this. She thought about the man in the back pew who had watched her walk away and had gone that same day to the general store and doubled what she had given, quietly, without asking anything, and had left it on her porch and ridden back to town and waited to see if the world would make sense of it. She thought it had. Timothy came in from the barn, and she turned, and he saw her at the shelf with the baby on her hip and the summer light in the window, and the look on his face was the one she had come to know best in the past year, that clear, unguarded warmth. The weather all moved out, and he crossed the kitchen and kissed her on the side of the head and took Edmund from her arms with the competent ease of a man who had learned the particular balance of a baby against his shoulder. And Edmund grabbed a handful of his father's shirt and held on, which was his way of expressing contentment. "Good day?" Timothy asked. "Very good," she said. "You?" "The north fence is done," he said, "and I think the second cornfield is going to come in even better than last year." She leaned against him briefly, her hand on his back. "Good," she said, and the word held everything she meant by it. Outside, Dusk Creek was doing what it always did in July, managing the heat with the resilient, ordinary stubbornness of a small town that had decided to exist here and was not going to reconsider. The Copper Spur had its regular customers. Harold Finch's store had its regular business, and the account of one Cora Slater, formerly Merriweather, was fully paid and running a credit for the first time in 3 years, which Harold Finch had noted in his ledger with a satisfaction that was not entirely businesslike. Reverend Hartwell had settled into the life of the town, with the comfortable fit of a man who had found his right congregation. Martha Hendricks's boarding house was full up with the summer traffic, and she was telling people she had never been so busy and did not seem to mind a bit. Doc Pierce was running her small practice and minding various people's health and their business with equal thoroughness. And in the back pew of the church, on the following Sunday morning, Timothy Slater sat next to his wife, which was where he sat now, no longer in the back alone, but in the middle rows where families sat, with Lily on one side reading the hymnal with the focused attention she gave to everything, and Edmund on Cora's lap practicing his grip on her sleeve, and Reverend Hartwell's voice going up to the pine rafters with the hymns rising behind it, and all of it. The whole warm, solid, ordinary, remarkable thing of it felt to Timothy Slater like the answer to a question he had been carrying in silence for 13 years of moving across the face of the land. He looked at Cora's profile in the Sunday light, and she turned and saw him looking, and she raised an eyebrow in the way she had that precise, slightly amused look that was one of his most favorite things in the world, and he smiled and looked back at the hymn book and sang, properly this time, having learned the words. The music went up through the rafters and out into the blue Texas morning, and the October anniversary of the day. A woman with 2 jars of blackberry preserves had walked into a church, and changed a cowboy's life was coming around again. And outside, the land that they had planted and tended together was resting under the summer sun, and the shelf in the kitchen was full, and the children were growing, and the man who had once sat in the back pew alone had found, in the fullest and most lasting sense of the word, exactly the place where he belonged.